Good to be back. Traveled around and gotten our fill of Mexican food and barbecue and all that good stuff. It's good to be back home again and see all of you. If you want to turn your Bibles to the book of the Ecclesiastes, that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. Something I've been thinking about a lot, and I've been meaning to talk about some of these things, but then we got to Ecclesiastes and I realized I hadn't done a book sermon overview in a while, so that everything worked out perfectly. So we've been reading through in the Old Testament for our visitors, and we are just about to get to the book of Ecclesiastes. So I wanted to spend some time on this book, and it's one that we don't always talk about a lot, and I think there's probably some reasons for that, but hopefully by the end of the day, if we've never really wanted to look at Ecclesiastes and never really particularly enjoyed the book, hopefully this will at least change some of that. I asked the question as we start this lesson, if you ask anyone in this world what they desire most in their lives, what they want particularly in this country, most of them, once you get past the specifics, would basically say, well, I just want to be happy. I want to have the things and do the things that will make me happy. And they might even add, and I want other people to be happy too. I want to be able to accomplish that for those people around me as well, because that's what the culture that we live in focuses on. We live in a world and live in a country that is devoted to happiness. And it's right there in the Declaration of Independence. We're celebrating that today. And right there it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, over time, I think that language has shifted a little bit. When we think about how we look at that now, it's gone from a God-given right to pursue happiness to a God-given right to be happy. In whatever it is that I believe, whatever will make me happy, I have the right to do that, and I have the right to expect that it will make me happy. And if I'm not happy, then there's something wrong. And so we have created almost this cult in this country of self-help and self-love, the idea that my happiness is to be pursued at all costs. Whatever it might mean, living my best life, not wasting my time and energy on things that are negative, on things that are uncomfortable. We surround ourselves with people that will make us happy and that will affirm whatever it is that we seek from our happiness. And if we have something in our life that causes me strain or stress, we're just going to isolate that. We'll get rid of it. We'll cancel it. We'll mute it. We'll unfriend it, whatever it might be, because I don't want to feel that way. So then the question is, why are we? Why isn't this country happy? We own more, we know more, we have more entertainment than we know what to do with, we have fewer limitations on our behavior than ever in history, and yet continually we see studies in this nation that talk about how unhappy we are. There was, in 2016, Harris released a poll that said that 31% of the population of this country, the richest, most powerful nation in the history of the world, 31% of us would consider ourselves to be very happy, which is the lowest number since the poll began in 2008. The number started at 35, so it wasn't exactly a high mark at that point, but it's done nothing but go down. And in 2019, the World Happiness Report indicated that downward trend was continuing, and specifically cited the U.S. as the 19th most happy nation in all the world, which seems pretty odd to us because we have the greatest economy in the world. We have, I don't know if we have the most freedom or not, but we have certainly the most lax attitude towards whatever you want to do in your life, and yet for whatever reason, we're not particularly happy. And it was funny when I was putting this together. I told myself, you know what, I'm just going to stop at 2019 because 2020 is just not fair, because nobody was happy in 2020. It was the worst year in the history of the world, and we all know that. Yes, I know. But that didn't work for everybody. That was just me and Laura. But here's what was interesting. When the report in 2020 came out, nothing really changed. We didn't get any more unhappy than we were before. As much as we talk about how miserable it was, it didn't really change how we viewed our life, which was kind of odd to me. But I think it points to something. And that is that our happiness and our unhappiness isn't necessarily about the hardships and difficulties in our lives. We've always had to deal with sickness and death and loss. That it became more dramatic, but it didn't really change anything. And it's interesting to see that the bad things don't necessarily impact our overall unhappiness, and the good things don't necessarily impact our overall happiness. And when we start to look at the culture around us and why our culture seems to be less happy than other countries, it seems to me that it's not so much that we're particularly unhappy. Because if you look at the language of the poll, they actually asked, are you generally happy with your life? 82%, yeah, I'm generally happy with things. It's not so much that we're unhappy, it's that we're not as happy as we think that we should be. And we don't know why. Because happiness, for whatever reason, doesn't measure up to the image that's up here. You know, me standing on a cliff, raising my, that's whenever you Google happiness, that's what you see. You know, that's just this experiential moment in my life, and that's what happiness is, and I don't understand why I can't capture that. And so in our culture, where our own personal happiness is basically the goal in life, the less fulfilled we are with our lives, the more we look for something that will bring us happiness, right? And so the more we fail, the harder we try. And we in this country probably spend more time seeking out happiness than in any other country in all the world. And maybe it's because we have more time and resources to do that, which I think is probably the case. We seek out happiness. We eat, we drink, we play games, we travel, we indulge in all kinds of desires, whatever they may be, some of them good, some of them bad. But we try to find those things that will make us feel a certain way. And we find that these end up being more diversions than true happiness. We just kind of get diverted from what we're actually going through in our lives. And so when those don't work, we're left with this desire to recreate that. And they keep us from wondering why we keep wondering why our lives aren't what we think that they ought to be. And so it's no wonder that the World Happiness Report described the U.S. as a mass addiction society. Everything from substance abuse, gambling, social media, risky sexual behaviors, all of these things. It seems like we have kind of a spiral because we can't get it, and so we try harder, and we keep going, and we keep going, and we keep going, and all it does is make us more determined to find something that's not there. There was one number in this that really jumped out to me, and there was a statement posed. You know, the poll basically posed a series of statements, and you said whether you strongly agree, strongly disagree. And the statement was, my spiritual beliefs are a positive guiding force to me. And the percentage of those who strongly or somewhat agreed with that statement was 66%. That should be pretty low to begin with. But considering the fact that it was the first time in the history of the report that it had ever been below 70%, and it was down from 77% when the report started in 2008, that should tell us something about the shift in our attitude about happiness. Now, again, correlation doesn't mean causation. I always have to remind myself of that. Whenever we look at statistics and we see two things and they seem like they're tracking together, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are necessarily causing one another, but it does kind of paint us a picture, I think, of what's going on in our culture. It's this idea of when we more and more consider happiness to be a physical thing that we can treat with physical solutions. It's not something that has anything to do with the spiritual. It's something that has to do with me creating a worldly experience to fulfill myself. And so that's a long introduction to get us to where we're going today, because I think the book of Ecclesiastes speaks to that. That's what this book really is about. It's about a writer who is trying to figure out how he can use all the resources and gifts that he has been given in this life to try to achieve this moment of happiness. And not being sure, having to come to grips with the fact that none of it seems to be working. It's written by someone, it's kind of interesting when you get into this, it's written by a man who calls himself the preacher, or Koheleth, I think is how it's pronounced. And it's funny, the trend now is to not say that this is Solomon. We find more and more preachers that will say that, well, we don't know it's Solomon, so we're not going to say it's Solomon, we'll just call him the preacher, or we'll call him Koheleth. But it seems pretty clear that this is who it's talking about. It's written by a man who claims to have been the king over Israel. He is the son of David, the wisest and the richest that has ever been to that point. And as we think about that, there's some arguments that have been made about that. And I'm not going to go into it. I thought about spending some time on that. But the reality is that the arguments don't really seem to address the fact that this is clearly talking about Solomon. Some have actually argued the idea that this is not Solomon himself. This is someone who was writing in the voice of Solomon. He's pretending to be Solomon to give his voice weight. And I'm not really sure, other than the fact that we are determined to try to figure out a way to explain this book away and say, well, this is just not a book that Solomon would have written. and we talked about this on Friday night, and I don't want to get into too much of it because we're already probably going to go over time. But I will say that I think when we understand Solomon and his life, and we think about our own life and our own struggles with sin and the influence of the world, this is the kind of book that would be written by a man who at the end of his life is coming to grips with the fact that he has been trying to solve a spiritual problem with physical things, knowing that he shouldn't have been doing it, and finally coming to a realization that those things were a mistake. That's the language that he uses. I think this is very clearly written about Solomon, and he makes a claim about himself. There's two reasons why I think Solomon wrote this. In the first one, we'll get to the second one, but the first one I think, and that's not going to work. All right. The first one is that, there we go. The first one is that he makes a claim for himself at the end of this book that I don't think could be made if it's just some random scribe that decided to go back and assemble a bunch of notes. Notice what he says in chapter 12. We focus on the end statement, and sometimes we miss this. The words of the wise in verse 11 are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. And my son, beware of anything beyond these. Think about what he's saying. The idea that first of all, these words are like goads. They're intended to be inspirational. They're intended to motivate us. But more important, they're from one shepherd. Well, who's one shepherd? I think we understand who that's talking about, don't we? Now, shepherds are often used to describe the leaders of Israel. But when the Bible talks about one shepherd, it is always talking about the divine. I don't know that there's any exceptions to this. Psalm 80, verse 1, God is referred to as the shepherd of Israel. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, and you who lead Joseph like a flock. You are enthroned upon the cherubim, shine forth. And we remember from the Ezekiel class last year, the discussions about God who is promising Ezekiel that he will set up one shepherd, my servant David, both in chapter 34, verse 32, and again in chapter 37. The idea that Jesus was going to be set up as this one shepherd who is going to be separate and above all the other shepherds in the world. And he describes himself in the same way in John chapter 10 when he says, I am the good shepherd. And the significance of that we understand, from the story of the rich ruler when he came to Jesus and said, good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, why do you call me good? There's no one good but God. There's a significance to calling himself the good shepherd. And there's only one of them. And if you notice what Solomon, I believe, writes here, and he describes these things, he says not only are they from one shepherd, but he says, beware of anything beyond these. Don't look for answers in worldly wisdom. Don't go looking for other things that you may have seen or heard that might try to explain these things because they're not going to work. Now, that sounds kind of familiar to us as well, doesn't it? That's the language right out of Deuteronomy chapter 4, where Moses tells the people, you shall not add to the words that I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you. Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 4, that you may learn to not go beyond what is written. That we have a source of answers that we need to focus on. And the reason we can do that is because these words aren't from men, they're from God. We talked Friday night in the class about how God gives wisdom. And in Proverbs 2, remember in verse 6 through 9, he describes the personification of wisdom, saying that the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice, watching over the ways of the saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity in every good path. And Ecclesiastes almost seems to echo that. Because if you'll understand all of these things that I'm saying, that they are from God, and you will accept them as such, all these other concepts that he struggles with throughout the book are now going to come into a lot clearer focus. Let me think about this. There's a question that the world often asks us. Does God want me to be happy? Have you ever had anybody ask that or heard that slide or heard that question that is asked? The message of Ecclesiastes is if I want to answer this question, I need to go to God. We oftentimes hedge this a little bit. When somebody asks, well, does God want me to be happy? Well, we usually say, well, it's not about happiness. And we start talking about, we're to rejoice, but we're not really, God doesn't promise that we're going to be happy. He promises that we're going to have joy, and that's not really the same thing. And we have those discussions because we look at happiness as an emotion that is in a lot of ways out of our control. And there's truth to that, right? We're not always going to be happy. There's things that are going to happen in our lives that are going to make us unhappy. And you remember in Romans 12:15 when Paul talks about the idea of rejoicing with those who rejoice, weeping with those who weep. Well, if we were promised that we were always going to be happy, that we were always going to be in a state of rejoicing, then why would we need this? We're called to help those who are struggling in this. We're given joy, but we're also going to suffer these times of difficulty and times of loss. And I would suggest to you that a lot of it depends on how we think about happiness. Are we thinking about happiness in terms of the happiness of the moment or the happiness that characterizes my life? And if we answer it from that standpoint, I would say that God absolutely wants us to be happy. He calls us to be happy. And he wants it so much that he wrote this book to tell us exactly how we can be happy. But the point is not to tell us how we can be in a constant state of happiness, how we can avoid all those things that make us unhappy in the world. The point is that he teaches us that if we look at life the way that God looks at life, the way that God designed it to function, we can be happy. Because Solomon describes what that pursuit is like, doesn't he? In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, where he starts this book, and he writes through the passage that we're probably all familiar with. If you want to read along, beginning in verse 2, he describes what it's like if I try to use this life as a way to perpetually find happiness. He says, vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils into the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south, goes around the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuit the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, where they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it can be said, see, this is new? It's been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. So sum that up. Nothing is new, nothing changes, nothing lasts, nothing fulfills, and nothing answers. Are we having a good day so far? Are we cheery so far? As I mentioned, Solomon, I think, has to be the writer for this. This is the second reason I believe it, because nobody other than Solomon was qualified to say this. Because I can't just tell you that nothing will satisfy any of these things unless I've tried everything. I always think about people who say, everybody who says that money can't buy happiness just didn't have enough money to make the payments. And I don't know if that's true or not. Well, I do know it's not true. But that's the idea that we have. Well, you can't really say that we can't have happiness unless you have tried every aspect of life. And that's how people approach it. I'm going to do everything I can in this life, and I'm going to be happy somehow. Solomon was able to do that. He had the resources to do that. And we see, as he talks about it in chapter 2, verse 10 through 11, that whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did everything. He talks about the idea that he amassed gold for himself. He amassed servants. He built buildings. He did everything that he could possibly do. Used all the resources at his disposal. And what was his reaction? Verse 11, I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. And the reason for that is that Solomon learned a fundamental truth. Everything ends. Nothing is forever. Everything ends at some point. There's a very real condition, and it's called, I don't know if this is the official term of it, but it's called post-Everest syndrome. Maybe you've heard of it. It's applied mostly to people who climb mountains, particularly Mount Everest. But it's applied in other areas in a more figurative way. The idea that here's somebody who's climbed Mount Everest, or maybe he's failed. But whatever it is, I've gone through this experience, and then what happens? There's a marked, it is common among those people to see depression, lack of motivation, change, and part of that's just changes that go through your body. You know, you've been in a life or death situation for weeks or however long it takes you to climb that mountain, and you get back down, and all of a sudden you're in a normal life. How do you adjust to that? How do I kind of gear myself back down? What do I do? But even more to that, I think, is the idea of how do I top this? I just climbed Mount Everest. What in the world can I do that will be better than that? And we see people unhappy as a result. There was a story I was reading about a man named Jordan Burroughs, who 2012 Olympic gold medal as a wrestler. And he described what it was like to win that gold. You know, he said, I wanted to be an Olympic gold medalist. I was extremely successful. I was recognizable to sports fans. I was being blown up by every wrestling fan in the community. My ego was huge. I idolized winning. I believed that all my success was due to everything I had done. I was extremely prideful. So he wins the medal. And he stands up there and he starts to think about what he's accomplished. And he said, my first thought was, that's it. I thought once I became an Olympic champion, I'd feel complete. I'd feel whole. I'd be extremely happy and joyful, and that this would be the best time of my life. But instead, as he said, it felt empty because there was nothing else for him to do. He realized the same thing that Solomon described there. That if I'm pursuing happiness by worldly accomplishments or fame or some other cherished goal in life, it's always going to be empty because it always comes to an end. Solomon learned this meaningful key to happiness in his efforts, right? He talks about the idea that I found that God gives joy in the doing of something, in the creation. And maybe if you've had projects, and some of you I know have, where you really enjoy it, and you have this pleasure in doing that. But then when it's over, we get to the end, that feeling's kind of gone. The goal's been accomplished. There's nothing left. And Solomon's wisdom kind of kicks in at this point, because in chapter 2, verse 18 through 23, he says, I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or foolish, yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This is also vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all my toil under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This is also vanity and a great evil. What is a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toiled beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is of vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This is also vanity. Everything ends. And even if I think, well, you know, maybe I can build something that will last beyond me. So yeah, I am going to die, and I can't do anything about that. But at least I can make something to remember me by. But wisdom says, well, wait a second. I just built this really great thing, but I don't know what's going to happen. I can't control that. You know, maybe they plow it and put up a parking lot after I'm dead. I don't know. Or maybe the person that inherits what I've established really doesn't care that much about it because he didn't put any effort into it. So he treats it, you know, shabbily and doesn't keep it up and doesn't maintain it. And within a few years, it's falling apart. The thing which I had built to be eternal is eventually going to fall away through time and neglect. And so 2 chapters in, we've established that nothing lasts and nothing matters. It's no wonder we view Ecclesiastes as a negative book. And it's no wonder that a lot of times that probably we just aren't really that interested in studying it. We get about this far and we say, okay, I get the point. Life is meaningless. Let's just move on. But there's more to it than that. And I would argue, this is going to sound weird, that Ecclesiastes can be a very positive book, depending on how you read it, depending on your perspective, depending on how you view the answer that Solomon eventually is going to come up with. And it really starts with this. Am I asking the right question? Let's go back to that question we asked. Does God want me to be happy? I think one of the problems we have is that what we really mean is, does God want me to pursue what I believe will make me happy? That's really what people are asking generally when I ask that question. Is, does God want me to be happy in whatever it is that I decide to do with my life? In our culture, I think we tend to view the value of our lives in terms of whether I spend them doing the things that I want to do. And if you notice in the book of Ecclesiastes, a lot of the things that we see, a lot of Solomon's failure is linked back to the idea that he's trying to do things that will please him, things that will make me happy, things that will make me feel a certain way. They're really centered on himself and what he's going to do. And so the target, I think we target what we think will work, and we pursue that. And when it doesn't work, we shift to something that may seem different. But in reality, it's the same thing. It's maybe I pick a different hobby Maybe I pick a different path to fame. Maybe I pick a different means of self-fulfillment, but it's always the same thing, and it always has the same limitations. But Solomon introduces in his realization at the end of chapter 2, and it changes his approach. It changes the way he views life. We think about, a lot of times I've heard Ecclesiastes taught as, well, the first 11 chapters are about life without God, and at the end he drops in God. Well, if you read the Ecclesiastes, it's not true. The book is filled with God. The book is all about God. The idea of faith in God is interlaced throughout. And he starts it in chapter 2 when he comes to the realization that apart from God, we cannot have enjoyment. He says in verse 24, there's nothing better for a person that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment and toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleased God. This also is vanity and striving after wind. Solomon shows here, I think, why we can't truly enjoy life apart from God. Because unless I simply, there are some people, I tell myself, don't talk about whether somebody's happy or not. If they say they're happy, take them at their word. Maybe they are. It may very well be that the people are happy with their life without God. I suspect the reason is that unless we're just completely oblivious to the way life is, we have acknowledged the fact that basically life has no meaning, that there's really nothing to it, that everything is basically just a series of rushes from one experience to the next, and that basically I'm always going to be looking for that next thing, and that's just what life is. And if I can accept that and figure that out and just live with that, then I can probably manage to be happy and at least content to some extent. And that's the way a lot of people live their lives. But it's not the way that we were designed to live. It's not what was intended. Because in verse 11 of chapter 3, Solomon comes up with another important revelation that we need to bear in mind and explains so much about our experience on this earth. Because he says he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in man's heart. Yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to end. There's some uncertainty about what that word eternity, the translation of that. But most people argue that what he's talking about there is that I understand all the things we're talking about the temporary nature of life. And I understand that there's more than that there has to be something beyond that. And I want it. Because I know that that's something that it's a need that I need to have fulfilled. And he goes on in verse 17. He says that I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them that they may see that they themselves are beasts. For what happens to the children of man, what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast. For all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust they will return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? We have this desire inherently to outlast the things of this life. And we have the realization that we can't do it. We have the frustration that comes from wanting something eternal, but everything that we've been given to establish our happiness, at least in our view, in our worldly view, is physical in nature, and none of it lasts and none of it works. And from that standpoint, we start realizing we're no better than the animals. All we have really is basically to exist, to eat, to sleep, to procreate, and eventually to die. That's just what life is. If we take eternity out of the equation, if we take God out of the equation. But I would argue that the lesson of the vanity that Solomon learns is not an empty lesson of pessimism and futility, because he puts God back into the equation. And he says that it is a lesson of hope. And the argument, I think, is, or at least is implied, is that if God has provided me a desire for the eternal, then God has also provided me a means by which I can satisfy that desire. I think that's a necessary conclusion of what he's saying. I didn't create this desire. There's nothing in me that would want anything internal inherently, right? So it must have been given to me somehow. It must have come from God, someone who is eternal. And why would God give me this desire only to say that it can't be fulfilled? There has to be something eternal that can satisfy this longing that I have in my life. And if you notice, let's go back to what we were reading in verse 24 through 26. He mentions in verse 26, we often don't talk about this. Again, well, Ecclesiastes is talking about someone who's not serving God. Well, he makes it very clear in verse 26. We can enjoy life if we serve God. The one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. Yeah, I don't think he's teaching here that, I think he's saying that when we're in submission to God, when we put our trust in God, when we first seek and foremost serve God, we're going to be content to accept God's gifts, not for what we want them to be, but for what God intended them to be. And if we do that, we can be content. We can be happy with our lot in life, whatever that lot may be. We can truly rejoice in our lives on this earth because we know that we have meaning beyond what we seek in this life. There's that rhetorical question that he gives, which is, he asks, who knows whether the spirit of man goes up? And I probably shouldn't have even gone into this, but I felt like I needed to talk about it. It's going to make us run over even more. But I don't think the point here is that Solomon doesn't know. This is a rhetorical question. He's not saying, well, I don't know what's going to happen. I think he absolutely knew. We know that Solomon was given wisdom from God over all things that he needed to know. And God's never hidden the idea that there is a spiritual aspect of our life. From the very beginning, we see promises made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob that there is something beyond death. Whatever that may be, we're not always told clearly what it is. But he says that we have an assurance. We have a comfort that comes from God that goes beyond this life. I think and he's not saying here, he talks about the sinner having to collect and then give it up to somebody who has served God. Again, it's kind of like reading the Proverbs. The point is not that wicked people always suffer. Wicked people always give up their goods, and the righteous people always end up benefiting. The point I think he's making in this context is that the unrighteous person is always going to be empty because he's always going to give up everything that he wants. Whether it's in this life or at the end of life at death, it's all going to go away. But the one who pleases God, the one who serves God, is going to have blessings that are not going to be taken. And again, does Ecclesiastes say this in so many words? No. Does it imply it? I believe it does. So can I lead a happy and fulfilling life? It depends on how we view our life, doesn't it? Because this is where we struggle. Well, if God wants me to be happy, then why am I not happy? If God wants me to rejoice, why can I not rejoice? Why are there so many things in my life that are dragging me down, that are giving me difficulty? And it goes back to what we were talking about a while back, how I view happiness. Am I judging my life by what I'm going through right now? By the difficulties that I experience in my life right now? Or am I looking at it the way God sees it? Because if I look at it from the valley, well, what am I going to see? I'm going to see this. This is my life. We've all known people. We know people right now who are going through these things, who have lost loved ones, who are going through debilitating and maybe even fatal diseases, and they look at their life as it is right now, and they're despairing of it. They say, I wouldn't wish this life on anybody. And we can't see that there's something beyond that God has promised that there are other parts of my life rather than what I'm going through right now. Maybe I'm on the hill. We've already talked about that. If I look at my life from the standpoint of standing on top of the hill, all I see is the big slope going downward. And I think to myself, I've reached the top. I can't have anything better. And I stop enjoying the moment right now, and I start thinking about what the bad things that are now going to happen. My inability to stay on the hill, I have to come down. That's part of the Mount Everest syndrome. The idea that I get to the top, but if I stay up there, I'm going to die. I have to come down. Or do I see it from the standpoint of eternity? That's how God calls us to see life on earth. And that's not always an easy thing to do, is it? Notice in chapter 3. I could have spent a whole session on chapter 3. But we're not going to do that. But beginning in verse 1, he describes this idea that for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, as the song goes. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek, and a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to cast away, a time to tear, and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. In this life, if we approach our happiness, we approach it so many times by identifying whichever of these states that we're in. And that defines my life. Or maybe I say, you know what, I would really be happy if I had peace. Or if I had someone to embrace, or if I had a time time to sow, I have a project that I can do. That's the time when I'm happy. And I identify that, and I say to myself, if I can just get to that state, and I gear my life around building myself up into that state so that I can achieve it, well, what's going to happen? I'm pretty much going to guarantee that I'm going to be unhappy most of the time, because life is not going to be about that. It's never intended to be about that. The idea that and I think what Solomon's not saying here, by the way, is he's not saying that everything is beautiful in its time. In other words, killing sometimes is beautiful. War is sometimes beautiful. Hating things is sometimes beautiful. That's not the point that he's making. That word's kind of interesting. The word there apparently is not the sense that something is beautiful in itself. It's the idea that it is beautifully, it's made beautifully. It fits beautifully. There's a beauty that does not come from the thing itself. There's a beauty in seeing it in the context of everything else. I think that's a really important point about how God works in all things. Because think about that. What does God always do? One of the constant themes in the Bible is that God takes different disparate pieces and he puts them together and he makes something better than the individual pieces. Isn't that right? Isn't that the story of creation? God takes nothing and he assembles it. And the whole process is giving it order and bringing it in and bringing all those diverse things together into a united system. That's how he works in creation. That's how he works in family. That's how he works in the church. And that's how he works in life. The beauty of a thing is in its completion, that it fulfills the plans of God. Now, does that mean that God plans every single thing that we do? I don't think that's the point. Does God plan a specific tragedy in my life so that I can have a wide experience? I don't think that's the point. The point is that the nature of life is that it includes all of these things. We're all going to go through all of these things that we've listed at some point. How I view my life is whether I accept that. Of course, that's easier said than done. That's going to require a good deal of faith. It's going to require a good deal of trusting God, that if I am in the valley right now, I understand that my life is not defined by the valley, that I have a hill, that God has promised that he will give me good things if I'm willing to put my trust in him. You know, it's interesting, this book, again, is described as a life without God. But this idea of trusting in God, I think, is implicit throughout the book. And again, we could spend so much time in this entire book. But if you go through chapter 4 through 8, we're not going to read from that. But it describes Solomon's attempt to reconcile what it means to live life on this earth without God. Bringing in the knowledge that God has designed things for a certain reason and for a certain purpose. And that if I exclude God, none of this makes any sense. He kind of concludes this section in chapter 8, verses 16 through 17, where he says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, but how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the works of God, that man cannot find out the works that is done under the sun. However much man may toil, he will not find it. Even though a wise man claims to know it, he cannot find it out. You know, if we're looking for definitive questions, why did God allow this to happen? Why has God made my life the way it is? Why does God put me in this situation? We're not going to get that answer because we can't see the plan. We don't see our lives as God sees our lives. We're impatient to get out of the valley because that's all that we can see at the moment. But I think that the last chapters, again, I hope that we're not looking at this saying, man, I never want to read this book again. This is horrible. Because the message that he gets and the message that he gives is that in God, this does not have to be how our life is. It is a message of hope. In fact, you know, we talked a little bit about this, that Proverbs in a lot of ways is kind of Solomon early on, and Ecclesiastes in some ways could be viewed as almost an answer to that. You know, because the idea, he talks about the idea in, I didn't put it in. Yeah, there it is. In Ecclesiastes 9, he talks about the idea that he who is joined with all living has hope. You know, earlier on in the book, he said that it doesn't matter. It's better to be dead than to be living and to see all the things that's going on in this life. But having added God into this equation, he says that there's something better. There is something worth living for because the living has hope that he doesn't have to live like this. He doesn't have to be foolish. The foolish can be wise. We talked about this in Proverbs 1. The image of wisdom crying out in the streets, appealing. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. We can be wise. We can understand these things if we're willing to listen to God, if we're willing to listen to that message. If you notice in that chapter, he also acknowledges that wisdom is still better than folly. There was a point back in chapter 2 when he talked about the idea that the wise man, the foolish man end up in the same place. What's the point of even being wise? We're all going to die. But by the end of the book, he recognized that wisdom is still better than folly, even if nobody listens to your wisdom. It's still going to lead you to a better life if it is a wisdom that comes from God. And so in chapter 7, in chapter 9, he turns away and he gives us this message of hope. He says in verse 9 of chapter 7 of chapter 9, go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife that you love, all the days of your vain life that he has given under the sun, because that is your portion in life. And in your toil at which you toil under the sun, whatever your hand finds to do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you're going. If we still see our lives as a gift from God, as opposed to something, as we talked about, that we view in this country that we are entitled to. I am entitled to be happy. Or do I see my times of happiness in this life as something that God has given me specifically for my good? It changes the way that we live our life, doesn't it? It changes our sense of gratitude. It's not an inalienable right for me to be happy. It is God blessing me. Do I see it that way? Solomon argues, I think, that the only way we can truly find joy and live is to live optimistically. It's kind of an odd thing, isn't it? A pessimistic book ends with a message of optimism. In chapter 11, what does he say? Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give portion to 7 or even to 8, for you don't know what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. And I think what he's saying there, by the way, is that you can't control your life. He said that if the tree falls, that's where it's going to lay. It's kind of, if the tree falls on my house, it fell on my house. I can't change that. That's what happened. That's the way life is. Worrying about it is not going to help. And anticipating the idea and dreading the next bad thing that's going to happen. Why are you casting your bread on the water? Well, I don't know what's going to happen. It might fail, yeah, but it might succeed. And his point is you need to live your life with the idea that I'm going to live life expecting success. I'm not going to let a fear of failure hold me back from doing the things that I ought to do in terms of my service to God and living my life. He goes on in verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow. He who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know what the way the Spirit comes to the bone of the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice, but let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart, the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Find joy and happiness in the things that God has given you. Don't expect this life to be something that was never intended to be. It's going to have difficulties. It's going to have hardships. But instead, recognize that the good that we have in this life is something that comes from God. Solomon concludes this book with the definitive statement that we all recognize. That regardless of how I view life, it doesn't change what life is. He says that we have been created and put on this earth and we've been given a purpose, which is to fear God and to keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. That should be Ecclesiastes 12, verse 10, by the way. I think we all know. That's our purpose. The problem is that we don't always accept our purpose. It's really easy to say this. You can have a happy life if you'll just accept that this is from God and that sometimes it's going to be bad and sometimes it's going to be good. You need to put your trust in God. I can say that all day long. But someone who's in the pit of despair someone who has lost a loved one, someone who is dying, and they are asking themselves, why can't I pull myself out of this? Why can't I simply do what Ecclesiastes is telling me to do? Why can't I simply trust God? Why can't I be happy in these difficult times? It's easier to say that than to do it, isn't it? And we do have to be careful about that. I remember somebody saying one time in a lesson, what we like to do when we see somebody grieving, we like to walk up behind them, slap them on the back and say, hey, rejoice in the Lord. It's going to be okay. Well, that sometimes does more harm than good. Because as we talked about very early, there's some times we're going to grieve and we're not going to be happy. We're not going to be rejoicing. Because that's not what life is necessarily about. And we look at the Bible and we see Paul saying, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice, and we wonder, why can't I rejoice? And it just makes it worse, because then we start to compound ourselves, because we start doubting ourselves. And as I've thought about it more and more, the reality is that we can be happy even when we're suffering. We don't have to allow those things to cause us, but sometimes they do. It requires a great deal of faith. When we think about Paul, how do we think about him? Do you think he was an unhappy person? I don't. Not in reading his letters. And the reason he was happy was not because he didn't have grief. I was just looking at this. I thought this was really interesting. In 2 Corinthians 7, he's describing his relationship with Corinth. And he says in verse 5, for even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted at every turn, fighting without and fear within. First of all, he'd written that letter, 1 Corinthians, and he didn't know how they were going to take it. And he knew that there were some things that they had to deal with. Well, are they going to do it? Are they going to push back? Are they going to listen to these people that are telling them not to listen to what I had to tell them? I don't know. But he says, but God who comforts the downcast comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted by you. So he told us of our longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced still more. Nothing miraculous happened. Life just continued. Because Paul put his trust in doing what God had called him to do, with the knowledge that it would work out to God's plan, and with a hope and a trust that the Corinthians would respond the way they ought to respond, and that's exactly what happened. And he was rewarded with joy. Not because Paul had miraculously changed Paul's heart. Not because Paul had the obstacles in his life removed. He describes all the beatings that he underwent later on in this passage. You think, how could this man be happy? Look at all the horrible things he had to go through in his life, and yet he was rejoicing. Maybe not at the time while he was being beaten. But it is true that in Acts chapter 5 or Acts chapter 4, when it talks about the apostles having been beaten by the Jews, telling them, don't speak about this man anymore. What does it say? They went from that place rejoicing that they had been counted worthy to suffer in the name of Christ. There's some joy that we can have when we see our suffering for what it is intended to be. And finally, in John 16, Jesus is talking to his disciples in a conversation that it would have been fascinating to be there to watch. Because they're hearing Jesus tell them all these things. They're trying to process. He's been telling them that he's going to go away. He's told them at least 3 times that he's going to be killed, but is going to be raised on the 3rd day, and they don't understand any of that. All they know is that Jesus thinks he's going to die, and more, that's what it looks like is going to happen, and they don't understand that. And he says in verse 20, truly I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. When a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. So also you have sorrow now. But I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. If our joy is in the right things, if our faith is in Christ, and if our one desire above all things, what would make me happy more than anything else, is to be with God. Is that really what will make us happy? Because if it is, God has promised we'll have it. And nothing in this world, no matter how bad it is, no matter how traumatic it may be in the moment, is going to change that. So how do we view our lives? Are we happy? That's what D. Bowman, I think, used to say a lot. He'd ask people, is everybody happy? I suspect the answer was, yeah, maybe. Sometimes it depends on the day. We can be happy in Christ. Don't let anybody steal your joy. That's the lesson for this morning. Hopefully it's been useful, encouraging. Again, Ecclesiastes doesn't have to be a depressing book if you're living the life that God has called you to live, if you're putting your trust in God. Now, if you're not, Ecclesiastes has a bleak picture of emptiness because life doesn't work without God. If you're subject for the invitation this morning, if you're online and have questions, if you want to know more about the gospel, if you want to understand how you can make your life right with God, if there's anything we can do to pray for you, maybe you're in one of those valleys right now and you need our prayers, you need our help, whatever we can do, let us know as we're letting our invitation song.